Now that we have a motion tween created, let's take a look at creating a classic tween. I'm going to create a new box and change it in color so we can tell that it is not the original. Make it kind of this yellow here. And I do want to create a new layer. You'll notice that I cannot create any sort of drawing on an existing motion tween because the symbol that's being used there is the only thing that's allowed to be on that layer. So we do need to create a new layer, and let's double click on that and call that classic tween. Now in order to create a classic tween, we have to have two keyframes, and we always want to make sure that we create a new layer first. I'm going to create a new file just to make sure that I show you one of the problems of doing this. So I'm going to create my box here, and I'm going to create a second keyframe, because in order to have a classic tween, you have to have two keyframes on the same layer, and they have to look somewhat different. It needs to be the same symbol or object that's on both keyframes, but at a slightly different place. Now I've created my two keyframes. I can right click in between the two and create a classic tween. Now everything looks great. It's animating over and then it stops. But if I look at my library, I want to point out that it made two symbols for us. It made a symbol for tween 1, which is the first keyframe, and then another symbol for tween 2. And this can be a very, very difficult thing, or a very bad thing. If I were to edit a symbol and go back to my tween, you may notice that everything looks fine, and then it changes when you get to the second keyframe. So the point of this is that you always want to make sure that you create your symbol before you create any new keyframes. So I'm going to create this kind of yellow square box here, and I'm going to convert this to a symbol before I do anything else. So right click on it and choose convert to symbol, or drag to your library, and this will be my yellow box. Now it's created it has a symbol in the library, and that's very, very important before you start doing any classic tweens. Now classic tweens can have some of the same properties as motion tweens, except we create the keyframes ourselves. So in order to create a new keyframe, just go to a different point in the timeline, right click and choose insert keyframe, or you can also take an existing keyframe and duplicate it over and then change it. So I can move my object at this keyframe, use the free transform tool, scale it up a little bit, skew it, rotate it, whatever I might want to do. And you'll see that we have a different look between the two keyframes. You can see that by scrubbing the timeline. Now right click in between the two keyframes and choose create classic tween. Now it's created that tween, and you can see the changes have happened. Now in order to have it go back to the original object, one of the nice things I like is that all you have to do is duplicate a keyframe. So I'm going to click on the first keyframe and drag it over to frame 20, but hold down the Alt key before I let go. This will duplicate that particular tween. Or that will duplicate that instance. It also duplicated the tween, which is important. You'll see that it actually has this series of blue dots here, or dots on a blue background, and that's because when I duplicated the keyframe, the tween is duplicated with it. And right now, there's no keyframe at the end, so it really doesn't know what to tween with. So I can right click on this and choose remove tween, and it'll go back to just a regular keyframe, and now I can create a tween in between the other two. So you'll see it goes back to what it looked like. Now we can change, of course, other things about this object. We can also add things like color effects. And this time, instead of the color effect happening across the entire tween by default, it only happens between the two keyframes. So this is the way animation or motion tweens used to be done in Flash for a long time. So if I want to go to the next place and insert another keyframe, you'll see that it keeps the same settings. And let's see what happens if we try 3D. Now I can insert a classic tween between them. And here's something very, very important. Notice that we did insert a three-dimensional change, but that three-dimensional change does not animate. So we might need to remove that frame or remove that keyframe, and I can do that with clear keyframe, and then I can insert a new keyframe, and then when I do my change, I can do color effects. I can also do filters, which we haven't played with. You have to be careful about applying filters, because if I do filters and do color effects, you'll notice that I have a black background or a black shadow, but it's red, and that's because I have the tint happening at the same time. So you can really only do one or the other. You can't really do both at the same time. So I can remove that filter, and I'll just keep it to the red right now and change it just a little bit more. So you'll notice that with this type of tween, it's a little bit more manual, because you have to create keyframes each time you want some sort of visual tween, and you don't have the ability to use the motion editor the same way. And you'll notice if I click on the motion editor, it says, you can't use this with this type of object. Now, I do want to point out, I'm going to remove that tween, that you can mix and match things on the same timeline. This is maybe not a great idea, but it is possible to do. I'm going to right click on that tween and choose Create Motion Tween. And you'll notice that actually it did not include it on the same timeline. It actually moved it up to a new timeline. So really you can't do both types of tweens on the same timeline like I thought you might be able to. So it actually has broken that for us, and it has gotten rid of our keyframe. So that's probably a bad idea. So let's Control Z to undo that. And I'd like you to finish the rest of that timeline with a couple more little keyframes of things that you want to do. And in the meantime, we're going to go on to the shape tween. Now the shape tween is the oldest style of tween in Flash. Let's double click on it, the layer that we make for this tween, and call it shape tween. Now in order to use a shape tween, you guessed it, we need to use shapes. So it means if we're going to use some sort of drawing object, I might use, the rectangle is probably the best one. I'm going to go off of the object drawing mode and be in shape drawing mode, and I'm going to draw a new object, and I'll make it a different color so I can see it's obviously different. And now I have my new shape here, and I can tell it's a shape by when I click on it, I'll get my my series of dots. Now in order to create a shape tween, we need to create two keyframes like the others, but we don't have to have some sort of symbol, and that's because, of course, we're dealing with shape tweens. So let's right-click in between and choose Create Shape Tween. Now, you'll notice that a shape tween turns green, so we can tell it's different, but in order to have the shape tween, of course, show any effects, we need to do something like change our colors. We can change the colors of our strokes, our fills. We can change the width of our strokes and the color of our strokes. Whoops. Let me go to a stroke setting here. And you'll notice that those color effects have changed over time when I look at my shape tween. I can insert another keyframe later. Insert shape tween. Oops, insert keyframe, sorry. And I can move my object. I can change other settings about it. And here's what else you can do. I'm going to go to another time, insert a keyframe, and now I'm going to modify my shape by clicking off of it and then dragging over the different lines. And here's where you really get to see the power of shape tweens. Shape tweens have the ability to have all sorts of different distortions as well, which is what makes shape tweens so unique to the other types of tweens out there. The ability to have distortions can be really, really nice. Now, for this last keyframe, I'm going to create one last keyframe at frame 55, and I'm going to do something to really mess around with my shape. I'm going to draw a few more shapes inside the same layer. So let's go to frame 55 and create a bunch of more shapes here. So even though this is possible to do, this is probably a bad idea, because this is what happens with your shape tween when you get a bunch of different shapes on the same layer. Occasionally this type of result might work out well when you have it precisely done, but typically this is going to be an indication that you are using shape tweens in an incorrect way. So anyway, I'd like you to play around with shape tweens and change the colors and strokes and all the different settings during your different keyframes. And when you're done, save your work. And that's an introduction to the 3 basic types of tweens in Flash CS4. Thanks.